So this response is about adulthood, and I really liked the quote that was at the end of the Adulthood Begins at 25 article. It was saying adulthood is realizing that everyone else is just winging it too. But then actually the more that I thought about it, I was like, I'm not sure that is adulthood, or at least that's not early and emerging adulthood, because I think in early and emerging adulthood, we're still, especially when we look at other people who seem to be like getting it right, it takes some time for us to be able to come to this conclusion or this awareness, which then caused me to challenge what I had originally written down for, what is adulthood and when does that happen? And what I'd originally written was that it's when we begin to have a real sense of what is really satisfying to us. And then I wondered, is this not something that happens though, more so in our 30s? And in considering that dynamic, in the recognition that we ask emerging adults to, in society, to commit to so much, like high-stake commitments, without really having an opportunity to begin to explore who they are outside of that original structure of wherever they grew up in childhood and adolescence. So I think that the emerging adulthood element does begin probably around 18. Not so much that our brains are completely developed, but just a recognition that there's still some growth that's happening in that stage. And I think some of the rites of passage can include moving out of our parents' homes, maybe going off to college, or even from there, especially like starting our first job, and maybe when we have our own health insurance, beginning to become more financially independent, even if that financial independence is taking on our own debt. Cohabitation, like we saw with Ashton in the 21 and up video. And from my own personal experience, when I got to vote for the first time for a presidential election, that felt like a really big responsibility. Something that I felt proud of, and like, okay, maybe this means I'm an adult now. And then as I think about that, like having to wait, and then at 21, being able to legally drink. So those are some of the things that come to mind when I think of different rites of passage. At the same time, I feel like these are all very externalized constructs, and it, for me, that time period in some ways felt more like I was playing adult as opposed to necessarily really being adult, because a lot of the cues that I was taking for how to build my life and what a successful life looked like, I think were still much more externalized than I felt like they were at the time. Let's see. So I was just considering the documentary and watching Edie, who had a child at 19, so she had a 3-year-old in the video, and thinking about her and then thinking about Lewis and some of the challenges that he faced throughout his life, and the recognition that situations can force some of us to have to grow up a lot sooner than others. And then, what are those implications? What kind of impact does that have on us as far as development and just life satisfaction, when parts of growth that maybe should be very self-focused and self-centered, there's just not the space for that to happen. And then the neuroscience, and taking into consideration the TEDx talk, the speaker was talking about the ability to recognize emotional states and kind of what is underlying just by perceiving body language and reading social cues. And then I found it fascinating, the brain imaging and what we can see. And obviously we've talked quite a bit about the prefrontal cortex, or the prefrontal lobes not being fully developed until the age of 25, but I also thought it was interesting that it was said the medial cortex is much more active still in adolescence, and then we see that start to go down as the individual or the brain develops and moves further into that emerging adulthood stage. And the same around the limbic system with regards to like emotion and reward and risk-taking with friends, that area is more active in adolescence and late adolescence and begins to decrease as we see a more quote-unquote adult brain being developed. And with that understanding in place, again, remembering the kind of decisions that we're asking 18-year-olds sometimes to make, and in particular the biggest being the financial debt around choosing a career that they may or may not ultimately have much interest in. So as a counselor, I think these would be very typical things that could come up, and especially the piece about like, am I normal? Am I moving at the right pace? Can I trust myself? And I think that I would just want to validate, what that individual's experience is and help to guide them to learn to be able to trust what their true internal signals are, and that they can move towards those things and be able to expand a broader view about what a life can look like, a satisfying life, because I think a satisfying life might really look like a non-traditional way of engaging. There seems to be a lot of us who aren't feeling so fulfilled. Yeah, I feel like maybe there's something I didn't answer, but maybe not. So, okay.